I'm Dina Bowman, Principal Research Fellow working in Economic Security at the Brotherhood of St Laurence. If I wince, it's because I have a very bad back, because I have been carrying a very heavy baby the last little bit, and I'm not made for it. First of all, I'd like to, you've got everything to eat and drink, fine. We're going to have a presentation from China Mills from London, but first of all I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet. And I must say, for those who are lucky enough to have the welcome to country and smoking ceremony downstairs, it was fantastic. It was a fantastic experience. ACU has some particular words which I will read in line with their traditions. So in continuing ACU, and I would say BSL's commitment to reconciliation, and in line with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tradition, it's customary to acknowledge country as we pass through. Today we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, traditional custodians, of the lands and waters, and thank them for their continued hospitality, and a special thanks, of course, to Daniel for his welcome to country. We acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture that has a unique role in this region. We also acknowledge elders past and present, as well as our emerging leaders of tomorrow, and thank them for their wisdom and guidance as we walk in their footsteps. So before we start with China, just some housekeeping. Toilets, as you noticed out there, I think it's an orange ball, they're just there. We don't have an Auslan interpreter this evening, but the event will be recorded and there will be captions. If you're tweeting, and I have made this up, so I do believe, I hope it's correct, hashtag BSL Talks, and at Brotherhood Info, and for TASA, the Australian Sociological Association, at Ost with a T, SOC. And it would be great if you can tweet if it happened. I need to pass on Professor Karen Soldatik's apologies. She was to co-host this event this evening, but unfortunately she's unable to be here tonight. So China, as you can see, is here. Now she's done a pre-recorded presentation, and the sound was quite faint, but with the wonders of technology and the wonderful people at ACU, they've made it as loud as we can. So I would ask when that starts, if you could please try to be quiet so we can hear it. But first I'll introduce China. So China leads the Deaths by Welfare project at Healing Justice London and is a senior lecturer in public health at City University of London, where she researches and teaches global mental health with a focus on state and corporate production of harm, distress and deaths by suicide. Just a warning, her presentation does paint a bleak picture of the harms that can be caused by punitive and inadequate social security. It's a cautionary tale, I think. But as China points out, there's also an opportunity for a movement towards life-affirming infrastructure that begins with, as she says, the truth that we are not defined by our relationship to work and that no one is burdened. So I will hand over to Massey, who's going to play China's presentation, and later on we'll have a panel and China will be able to respond to questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is China Mills and I'm going to talk to you today about our Deaths by Welfare project, which I lead at Healing Justice London. Thank you so much for being here. And so today I'm going to be talking about brutal systems that make life unlivable for certain people. And I'm going to be understanding people's deaths within the context of injustice and timeline in which they take place. I'm going to mention some people's names as a way to honour them, but I won't talk about any specific details or methods of suicide. And please then take part in this session in a way that honours how you're feeling and prioritises your care. My final slide also has a link to some resources that I hope might be useful if you need them. So the Deaths by Welfare project started in 2021 and investigates the links between the UK welfare, social security system and people's deaths, including people's suicides. And we do that by centering and learning from the expertise of the folks most impacted by welfare state violence, so especially disabled people. And the UK government has a stance that they constantly repeat about media reports on deaths linked to the welfare system. They say we take the death of any claimant seriously. Where it's appropriate, we undertake reviews into individual cases, but we do not accept the argument of those who seek to politicise people's deaths by linking them inaccurately to welfare policy. So between 2014 and 2022, the Department for Work and Pensions, DWP, which is the UK government department in charge of administering welfare, carried out approximately 260 reviews into the deaths of people claiming benefits. And redacted versions of some of these reviews, so they've never been made available in full without redaction, shows numerous recommendations identifying policies as potentially life-threatening. Yet the government has no system for tracking what, if any, actions were made in response to those recommendations. And they've never made public information about whose deaths have been investigated, not even to the majority of people's families. So, in contrast, many different groups have publicly emphasised the political nature of and linked government policy to benefits-related deaths. And that includes coroners, disability rights and justice activists, bereaved families, professionals. So here we see, for example, a number of people's suicide notes have named the government as being responsible for or playing a huge part in their death, such as this suicide note from Stephanie Bottrell, which was made public on BBC in 2013. We also see data, and in fact disability activists have been key in contacting epidemiologists to actually generate some of the data which shows links between welfare and people's deaths. And in 2015 it was estimated that 80 people per month were dying in the UK after being found fit for work. And we can see so many, just the absolutely central role of disability activism in making public the links between welfare policy and people's deaths. And here there's a picture of somebody holding a sign at a protest which says, "Benefit cuts are killing us." So a big part of our work in the Deaths by Welfare project has been creating a timeline, a sort of counter-history, and I've done that mainly working with the brilliant John Pring, who started Disability News Service in the UK, and we've also had loads of input from just brilliant disabled activists, as well as one welfare rights expert. So the timeline is made up of approximately about 500 entries, which currently date from the 1970s to 2022 and span over 350 pages. And we made the initial timeline based on the masses of experience and involvement in disability activism, journalism, research, and then of the people that initially made it. And then we did a public consultation in 2022 where we received about 30 pieces of feedback which we then incorporated. So why did we make a timeline? Well, we created it to try to piece together a chronology of evidence on welfare system and welfare reform related deaths. and to trace the strategies used over time by the government to deny accountability. So we wanted to piece together disparate documents like freedom of information requests, government responses, internal documents, these different kinds of evidence of dispersed harms and deaths, to allow us to look for patterns which generally remain hidden if we only focus on each of those documents or just single people's deaths individually. And the timeline enables us to track the delayed but deadly impacts, or what we've been thinking of as the slow violence of welfare policy. And now, without naming any methods of suicide, I'm just going to give you a glimpse of what the timeline looks like in terms of a tiny fraction of people who died in August and September just of 2013, so just in 2 months. And these are the people we know about, right? There'll be so many more. So on the 9th of August 2013, Mark Wood starved to death after being found ineligible for his employment and support allowance. He was found fit for work, which is an assessment carried out by private contractors, contracted out by the Department for Work and Pensions. And he died 4 months after his incapacity benefit was stopped. On the 23rd of August, David Barr took his own life, a month after he had learned that the decision to find him fit for work had been confirmed. 24th of September, Michael O'Sullivan took his own life after being found fit for work. He'd been claiming incapacity benefit due to mental health for quite a long time, and a coroner found his assessment was a trigger for his suicide and wrote a prevention of future deaths report to the Department for Work and Pensions, saying that there's a risk that future deaths will occur unless action is taken, and those future deaths have occurred. And then a day later, September 25th, Tim Salter took his own life, again after being found fit for work. And again, a coroner ruled that a major factor in Tim's death was that his benefits had been greatly reduced, leaving him almost destitute. So as well as charting the enormous harms of the welfare system, traces it charts the incredible resistance, especially from disabled people, against this violence. And so 3 years before a lot of these deaths, and actually 2010 was when we started to see some deaths starting to happen, we see the formation of some of the groups that have become really central in disability activism around welfare. So the formation of black activists rising against cuts, Black Triangle Campaign, Mental Health Resistance Network, Mad Pride, and Disabled People Against Cuts, all really, really key groups. So I would say that a core part of the work involves co-creating these counter-histories of slow bureaucratic violence to counter this cover story of so-called dependency and deservingness, and undeservingness, right? Used to justify dismantling social safety nets and diverting public resources away from poor people, and especially racialised and disabled people. And this work shows us that disproportionately distributed harm, premature death, targeting racialised, low-income and disabled people is a feature of the welfare state in the UK and not a bug. So when welfare violence is named only as flaws in the system, something that I am sometimes guilty of doing, it risks implying the system is broken rather than functioning as it is designed. Flaws channel our energy into correcting and reforming a violent system. Tweaks and reforms in parts of the system might never be enough because the underlying logic and profitability of these systems create conditions that devalue certain lives and kill people. Some may ascribe people's deaths to flaws, but others might see them as endemic to part of a system that needs dismantling and creating anew, with disabled people and the analysis developed through lived experience. And I've found really helpful for this the tools crafted by activists and educators of disability justice and transformational justice and abolition, so folks such as the brilliant Mia Mingus. And we might think together using that thinking about what non-reformist reforms could look like in relation to welfare state violence. The small incremental changes that are consistent with collective transformational demands, offering us ideas for collectively creating a long-term vision for life-affirming infrastructures built on interdependence and the inherent value of all of our body-minds, the bones of the societies that we want to live in and thrive in. And so putting lived experience of state violence at the centre, I think, is absolutely key to tracing connections between all of those people who the state tells us are burdens. And it shifts our analysis in a way that I think opens up potentials for cross-movement solidarity and for us to do, as Kim says, progressive, transformative coalition work. I would say, though the work is really harrowing, one of the messages here is that if environments are designed to be hostile and to elicit suicidality, then they can also be designed differently around social justice. And uncovering these stories and counter histories is essential to exposing and countering this cover story of welfare dependency and undeservingness. And these stories must be rooted in the truth that no one is a burden and no one should be defined by their relationship to work. So thank you so much for listening. Here's some resources if you need them and you want to check out our work at Healing Justice. Also, we've got a podcast series if you want to hear from some of the folks with lived experience that have been so just integral to the work that we do. Sending you love and solidarity from the UK.
Thanks, China. That was tremendous and certainly thought-provoking, a bit bleak, but it is a cautionary tale. So to consider some of the implications of China's presentation and reflect on the need and opportunities for change in Australia, we'll be joined by an expert panel. We have 6 panellists, so if I could ask you please to come up to the chair. And what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, I will introduce everyone so you know who's up here, and then I'll just give a brief introduction and then go to questions. And each of the panellists will have an opportunity to make comment, and then there'll be time for some questions. And we'll go to some more of the panellists and we'll do it like that. We're hoping for a lively discussion and questions and discussion rather than presentation as such. So I'm going to stand up now because if I sit down and I won't be able to get up. So I'm going to introduce people. First of all, I'll do it in the order I've got, and so perhaps you can wave just to indicate. So we've got Natasha Thompson. Natasha has built strong self-advocacy skills through her personal health journey with, and I might not be pronouncing this correctly, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, EDS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, POTS, and a motor vehicle accident. Repeated negative and traumatic experiences led Natasha from being a passive patient to an assertive manager of her own health and subsequently access to appropriate management of her conditions. Natasha actively amplifies the voices of people who have similar experiences in the hope that they can bring widespread, much-needed changes to structures and systems. In her sharing of her lived experience navigating the social security system, Natasha hopes that others will not have to experience the same trauma in accessing the help that they not only deserve but are entitled to. And Natasha is part of is it technical experts? No?
Yes, so the technical experts on social security within the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations.
Yes, so technical experts in social security for Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, AFDO. Next we have Narita Waite, yes, who's the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. She's a Yorta Yorta and Narrandjeri woman with Tangaron, should know, Seymour, yes, connections, and she's an experienced lawyer and advocate with practice and policy expertise in a wide range of areas, including criminal law, and civil law, family law, child protection, family violence, and deaths in custody. Some of her more recent work includes establishing a specialist legal service embedded within the Victoria Aboriginal Legal Service for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and the Werraway Police and Prison Accountability Practice, which has supported several clients in coronial matters relating to Aboriginal deaths in custody. We have Therese Edwards, who is the Chief Executive of Single Mother Families Australia. In 2022, she was appointed to the Women's Economic Equality Task Force. Therese has held various executive positions, including Economic Security for Women, the Australian Women Against Violence Alliances, and was a former Deputy President of ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Services. Therese received the Hester Unsung Hero Award in 2019 for her work advocating for single parents. Now, we next have Elise, and I'm not reading a message, I'm reading the bio. So, excuse me while I do that. We have Elise Klein. Dr. Elise Klein, OAM, Order of Australia Medal, is a multi-award-winning researcher and associate professor of public policy at Crawford School at the Australian National University. Her research is situated in the intersections and cracks of development, social policy and decoloniality and care. Elise has held various roles, including working on the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on women's economic development and the Human Rights Committee within the United Nations General Assembly. She holds a DPhil in International Development from the University of Oxford and was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia and the Paul Burke Award for Early Career Research both in 2019, and she's the co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab. So we've got some highly distinguished people with us, including Dr. Chevelle Khan, who's a teaching associate at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. His research draws on the theoretical perspectives on how theoretical perspectives, I'll get there, draws on theoretical perspectives to map how risk and insecurity systems, insecurity constructions operate within the Australian social security system and are reinforced by media. His doctoral thesis, I was his supervisor, so I'm proud, was one of his supervisors, explores these interrelated dimensions through a case study of the pre-employment program Parents Next and its associated policy media nexus. Chevelle has held research associate positions at the Centre for Program Evaluation at the University of Melbourne and at the Brotherhood of St Laurence Research and Policy Centre. Last but certainly not least, we have Kay Cook, who is a Professor and Associate Dean Research in the School of Social Sciences, Media, Film and Education at Swinburne University of Technology and is a current member of the Federal Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee. Her feminist, sociological, interpretive policy research centres on the experience of policy targets in order to speak truth back to government power. Her work has focused most specifically on the unjust construction and treatment of single mothers in social policy and family law, particularly with respect to child support, government benefits, family violence and financial abuse. So we've got a power-packed team to reflect on some of the implications.
Payment if they had a child out of wedlock, and it has been, nothing has come easy. Like every turn it has been a challenge. But in 2006, the role of parenting, the amazing task of single parenting, of seeking safety, about nurturing and loving your child was completely diminished, and it no longer counted, and you're classified as being unemployed. So since 2006, the organisation I proudly represent today have been fighting against that. And it's like overnight success of 10 hard years, including exhausting every domestic avenue, writing a complaint to the United Nations. But finally we got the age lifted from 8 to 14. I feel it is unfinished business, so we will be going to 16. But to answer your question more succinctly, Dina, I think what we can start to do is to use words like respect, to talk about strength-based, to talk about, rather than the one that I particularly love reframing is rather than intergenerational dependency, let's talk about an intergenerational investment. How amazing that is. So I think we've got an opportunity to go a bit further. The other area where I think we've got an opportunity, and I'd love to have a bit more time to talk about some of the stories behind the scenes, but Parents Next, when that got abolished, thank you. When Parents Next got abolished, it was friggin' awesome. And I got a chance to ask and respond to a question on ABC. Was this program racist? No. Was this program sexist? Hell yes. And it was also racist. And all through the advocacy. So first of all, it was so hard. So the workforce inquiry was started without Parents Next. So it took enormous amount of work and advocacy and wearing people down to get Parents Next to be part of that workforce inquiry. So nothing, as I said, nothing comes really easy. But then to get the message that it was going to be abolished, and it was going to be abolished with the suspension of payments finalised on that announcement. And I wrote to, I'll quickly just say this because I got the stop sign. I wrote to Minister Burke and shared with him the messages that were once of despair but were of women reclaiming their autonomy. And the last person I spoke to was the most amazing Indigenous advocate grandmother in rural New South Wales who went to a Parents Next meeting and was warned, because she was so vocal against it, that her mob, as she described to me, were at higher risk of being suspended than others because of her agitation. So we are in an exciting spot where we're starting to see that those punitive measures, they're really harmful, but the one question that I think that we should ask is actually how much do they cost? So how much does it cost to have those punitive measures and to have a system such as that? So I think that's my time. I think that's up. But we have got, the world has started to open up, and I think we've got to really now look at why we have mutual obligations in Workforce Australia and what purpose do they serve, and for whose purposes they serve. That's the next piece of work.
Yeah. Thanks, Therese. I gave you a microphone because China said she couldn't hear well. Yeah, indeed.
Yes.
And indeed. And maybe that's something, once everyone's had an opportunity to speak on the panel, to reflect, like, what is the role of mutual obligations? Is it something that we should, has the time passed for mutual obligations? How can, so that it's not necessary anymore?
Was there ever a time for them? I don't think so. I don't think so. Indeed.
So, Narita, I might hand you the microphone. And Narita, you're coming from a bit of a different perspective, Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, and I believe you've been focused on the discriminatory nature of the age pension, which will be now, you have to be 67, I think, to be eligible from 1 July. So perhaps you reflect on some of those concerns and how they cause harm and what might need to change and how things could be reframed.
Thank you, and hello everyone. And in that original intro, you probably heard my greatest hits collection. What you didn't hear is perhaps why this is important, not only to me but to my communities. Unfortunately, an area of focus for us has had to be the gap in life expectancy causes, in terms of pension access, because our people die earlier. For me, this has meant that my mum died at 52, her brother at 59, and her remaining 2 siblings have chronic illnesses before they were 60, which have rendered one incapable of working and the other purely pushing herself to work, because if she doesn't, she can't keep a roof over her head. And this is not some weird statistical fact of my family. It's every Aboriginal family, it's in every Aboriginal community. At the moment, our males are likely to die 3 years earlier, and our females at 3.7 years earlier. And many of this is chronic illnesses that are very familiar to us, such as heart disease, kidney disease, respiratory disease, cancer and diabetes are some of the biggest killers. And this lack of health outcomes is connected to colonisation, to racism, to not having the funds and resources to access healthcare, not being able to have a roof over your head, which obviously affects your health outcomes as many things as education level. And again, these are things that in our practice we see. I mean, just a few weeks ago, I think it was maybe 2, time's a bit fluid at Val's, by the way, we were hearing about a client who had difficulty getting access to healthcare despite having a heart attack, because they identified him as being perhaps exacerbating his suggested symptoms based on his race and his background. Those are not new. We've seen an Aboriginal woman years earlier lose her life at St Vincent's for some of those very reasons, and thank you for the time warning. So naturally, you probably want to know what the legal argument is for the case. I'll give you the brief overview, but I have my own resident legal expert over here, Alex, who can answer all your questions after this. So the reason, the legal argument is that our anti-discrimination laws in Australia say that everyone should be equal before the law. This means that governments cannot make laws that give some people lesser rights or benefits than others. So that, in effect, in practicality, that's what the age pension does. It gives Aboriginal Islander people less access to the pension than non-Indigenous people because they're likely going to be dead. And we say for it to be fair and equal, our people should be eligible at least 3 years earlier, in light of the gap that I explained earlier. And it's really about ensuring that our communities and our mobs are better supported in later life and have the same right to age with dignity. That means that they don't have to work to the day they die. It means they have an ability to retire in dignity, to engage with their grandchildren and their mob, to engage in cultural activities, and to really make that journey into the dream time much smoother.
Thanks, Marina. So, if you were going to reimagine that situation, apart from that specific change, what else might you propose?
Other than lowering the pension age?
Yeah.
Certainly, I'd like to see the same dumb superannuation, noting that my mum's cohort, for example, started developing a super fund in the 1990s. I think I was like 3 at the time. So don't hold me to that date. But also, we'll need to see better implementation of the closed gap outcomes. But you've got to remember, these things are going to take time. Addressing the effects of colonisation, dismantling racism within the system, developing better social supports, as we've already heard here today, takes a lot of work. So these will take time. And in the meantime, we need to make sure that we give people a measure of dignity.
Thanks, Narita. We might turn to Natasha. That perhaps take it along.
Thank you, everyone. I would also like to note that my name is actually spelt incorrectly.
Is it? I'm so sorry.
There's no P in my surname.
I didn't think so.
No.
Oh, it is. Apologies. I'm
I
sorry.
will also apologise. I am on the back of COVID and into long COVID territory, which is extra fun as an immunocompromised disabled woman. And I've already had some fun experiences with the healthcare system recently that leave a lot to be desired, but only cement my desire to work to create systemic change. I will also say that I am mostly going to be reading off my notes just because COVID neurologically has just shattered me this time, and so if I don't look at what I've written, I am going to really struggle to effectively communicate what I feel is important to share. So when I first shared my experience with the DSP application and appeals process back in 2019, there were some obvious issues with the sector that stood out to me, and these haven't really changed. So I would also like to preface this by saying that these are far from the only issues within the sector, but these are the ones that have had a significant impact on me personally. And given that my lived experience, given that most of my advocacy work stems from my lived experience, these are what I want to touch on. The key issues that I really faced were the rate of payment, which is a huge issue with the job seeker payment as well, accessing the DSP to begin with, and then the security of having the DSP. So accessing the DSP is this huge and overwhelming task. It was worth the trauma that I was enduring. The initial application process is confusing and unclear. It's as if you're drip-fed information about what's actually required of you as you go through the process. Whereas had you actually been given information to begin with, then you could have had that all prepared. There's like nothing more frustrating than going to a specialist and getting a report prepared for your application to be told that, no, you're missing this piece of information, you need to get that back to us, oh, and we need that within 3 weeks. This is near impossible within a private specialist, which costs money and time and energy, and forget trying to do that in the public system. My application and appeals journey, and that really doesn't feel like the right word, it was more like a battle. It took 2.5 years, during which I was on the youth allowance student, well, I studied here actually, or the job seeker payment. It was limbo, and I was juggling the cost of living with my medical expenses, and I was drowning, and I ultimately accrued over $5,000 in debt. And I honestly don't know what I would have done if I hadn't eventually been successful in my battle for the DSP when I was, and that's the unfortunate reality for so many Australians who are still fighting for access. The cost of living is skyrocketing, housing and food is so unaffordable, and then factoring in any medical expenses, I attempted to calculate my monthly medical expenses, and I started crying when it was close to $300 a month. I did not finish that count for the sake of my sanity. I barely get by with the DSP now, and I certainly wouldn't be able to survive on job seeker. Then, so I'm going to try and sum up what I've got given the timing. Then there's the matter of security on the DSP. Managing any partial capacity to work is so complicated, and it's complicated. And work is a really important factor for people with disability. Like, it helps your physical and mental health immensely to feel useful and productive. And there's this constant fear that if you have one good day out of however many bad, and you try and do things, there's that innate fear that someone's going to see you and you're going to be reported and you're going to be taken off your payment. And it's this terrifying feeling, because even after winning what felt like this insurmountable battle, there's no real sense of relief or security. So the entire application and appeals process was like a full-time job, which is ironic given I was applying, because I simply couldn't work to the point to support myself. My key feeling from my experience was a sense of betrayal and the question of, why is my government, who is supposed to help its most vulnerable, treating me like this? And this has been a driving force for me in pursuing systemic advocacy, because the system needs to change. And there have been some changes lately. But the question is it enough? I don't think so. So. Yeah.
I might come back to you later, Natasha, about what the change is needed. I would say we did a report, it might be out there, called Dead Ends, where we looked at the situation of people on the partial capacity to work, or deemed to have partial capacity to work, who are stuck on job seeker payment, and just the complexity of the system. We've got a diagram just shows quite how complicated it is to get on disability support pension. I can't remember the figure, but it's something like 40% of claims are successful. It's a very low rate of claims that are successful.
And there were changes deliberately made to restrict access, and it had more than 3 times the intended. More than 3 times the intended outcome. But where's the whole, okay, maybe this is a little too harsh. There was no secondary review to then make it easy to find that middle ground. It just hasn't been done.
And it starts to make you think, is this a system that has been designed to be hostile? And so what are the changes that need to be made to enable and support? Now, mindful of time, we've got 3 more people who would like to reflect, but I think we'll just stop for a little bit, say 5 minutes or so. If anyone would have a question of the panellists so far, including China, if you could please put your hand up. And we've got these clever microphones on each table, which work if you press the button and it turns green. Anyone who would like to ask a question of China or our panellists so far? Yes, hello.
Hello. How is Dan Fisher's court case going for the age pension?
Did you hear that?
Yes, I believe it was a status update question. Yeah. So in terms of the case, it went to the full federal court. Judgment is due this year. Alex assures me it'll be this year, it'll be soon, but we're not sure. And then once judgment comes down, depending on the result, there of course there might be a High Court challenge, which would again see a further determination of about a year to a year and a half, being conservative here. Lawyers and judges take time, lots of time. But what is notable, I think, here is just the determination of our claimant, who's just amazing. I mean, he's a DJ for 3KD, which is our local Aboriginal Koori radio station. He's a cultural guide at Retore Bay Gardens, and he has a mission to go overseas and connect with communities. So he's, despite having chronic illness, despite wanting to retire into India, and also despite being somebody who was, forced into Sherbrooke mission, forced into what I call indentured slavery, which was the stolen wages, just has a real passion for justice and a real hopeful outlook, which I think we could all do sometimes.
Thanks, Lorena. Anyone else like to ask a question before I move on to the other panellists? Yeah, Chris. Just press the button.
Scared of this after what happened. Just asking to raise in terms of the amount of work and time it took to get that change, the Parents Next program abolished, whether you can give us a sense of how many people and hours and it took for that.
It started, the opposition started in, I was actually reading a submission on forced adoptions, and in 2012 I was highlighting then my concern of where this new program was going. Worked really hard. I don't know why Labor supported it in 2019. We got a Senate inquiry in Melbourne, I spoke at it. And then worked really hard. A few people here appeared before the Joint Parliamentary Human Rights Committee. And so the last committee was the third formal examination. And all of those committees that examined it, it was found to have breached human rights, as according to the Australian Human Rights Commission. So that gives you a sense of how much work was involved in that. I did have a meeting very recently with Dua and with the Secretary, and I did speak to them. I've got so many stories of what I spoke to them about, but one of the things I did talk to them about is that real pushback. I felt it every time I spoke. I felt that pushback. That is where there are people in the room, Angela Finch is one, who women stood up and spoke, and these are women who had they had no power. You walk into the providers and they control your economic survival. So if you didn't have your payments suspended, you became obedient. And I don't know which one is the biggest betrayal. So I cannot tell you exactly how many people were involved in the positive change, and hopefully a change that's going to pave us. But we had at least 3 examinations, and women just spoke and spoke and spoke. Plus we have one closed Facebook group, and the celebrations when those announcements went. I think I'll dine out on those celebrations for a long time to come.
Thanks, Therese. It's a good segue perhaps to go to Chevelle, whose research was about Parents Next, and particularly media framing of Parents Next as a program. As you could see with some of the information that China presented, often the media is quite demonising of people in receiving social security payments. So perhaps you would like to reflect on the importance of framing and how it might be reframed.
Yeah, so my PhD research, it found a very similar theme to what China discussed tonight, and that this idea of social security is increasingly associated with the idea of so-called welfare dependency. And welfare dependency in the Australian context is a very racialised and gendered construct. It draws upon the patriarchal ideologies and settler colonial ideologies to target so-called at-risk families and particularly Indigenous communities. And this has been touched on in Elisa's work as well. And we also have this idea of intergenerationality that's attached to this idea of welfare dependency, and this creates the impression that there's these contagion-like or transmissible risks that need to be contained, punitively managed, paternalistically managed. We saw this in the instance of Parents Next. We've seen it in the instance of the cashless debit card, and notably, the policies and frameworks surrounding these programs make reference to this construct of intergenerational welfare dependency. And my research suggests that the political legitimacy of this idea of the media keeps on circulating and reimposing these frames as the field that social policy making is to operate within, that social security is supposed to respond to this construct of intergenerational welfare dependency. And this contrasts with representing marginalised communities as enduring harms and environments that are designed to deter, discipline, and even induce social and physical death, as was poignantly discussed by China. And so I think it's framing and reframing is important to get to the crux of these mental models, and finding avenues and seeing the future is mutable, that we can change practices and that we can change systems.
Thanks, Chebelle. So, if you were thinking about a key change, what would that be to put us on the right path to a fairer social security system?
I really like the use of, I'm going to keep harkening back to China's presentation here, but Andre Gore's concept of non-reformist reform I think is really useful. We have this incremental work that needs to be done, but we also have to keep this transformative agenda in mind as something to anchor ourselves within. So on an incremental level, and sort of addressing what I was talking about before, the importance of framing, I think we as policy thinkers and practitioners need to address the idea of the mass media and think about, well, how do we mobilise the media to better reframe social security? And I think that here we can look to the example of Sweden. What happened in the 1960s and 1970s, there was so-called opinion-shaping activities that were used, and they were Femocrat-led, which was feminist bureaucrat-led initiatives that engaged with the media, engaged with radio programs, and produced different changes in the ideas of and the normative expectations around gender and family, and this was successful. It resulted in progressive labour market activation policies, and also the dual earner model became more prominent in the Swedish society. So I think we can think about that and learn lessons here in the Australian context about how do we forward a progressive reform agenda, keeping in mind the media. And I also want to reflect as well on keeping the eye to the future, onto the horizon, thinking about this transformative agenda. And I think we need to stop thinking about social security in terms of this binary of insecurity and security, security and insecurity, but perhaps something like social vitality. How do we promote these life-affirming infrastructures that China mentioned? And how do we move away from this idea of dependency to one of interdependency?
Thanks, Chebelle. And I think, in fact, I think we've got the report out there. We did a research with Peter Whiteman about the patterns of use of New Start allowance. It's the way the idea is somehow it's other people, them, others who rely on income support, whereas actually when you look at it, it's much more common than you might think. Many of us will rely on social security in some form across the life course, if not least the age pension if we're lucky enough to live that long. So it's to try to get that idea that social security is for all of us, not just for some. But Elise, it kind of links to what Chebelle was saying. You've been working very much around care and the centrality of care. It's a way of kind of, I'm going to say it, you did a launch of a report called Flip It, so I can't help it. You kind of flip the notion away from the centrality of work to perhaps the centrality of care. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no society, economy, there's no life without care. It literally underpins everything that we are, that we do, from the moment that we're born to the day that we pass. You know, care is such a critical part of our lives, and I think, you know, the social security system is something that China said I think is really important, revolves around the concept of work, and that those that are seen as deserving are those that, you know, have a close proximity to work. You know, the age pension is clearly one, and there's less stigma around that because you're seen as more deserving. The veteran payments also, you're sort of seen to have worked for the nation, so you're less stigma. But then, you know, the undeserving sort of space rests on an assumption that people aren't working. And I think, you know, with what Teresa's saying, and Chebelle's saying around sort of what happened with Parents Next, you see, you know, the questioning of the role of unpaid care, such critical work that, you know, is gendered, this assumption through mutual obligations that people aren't working. I think, what we still see though is new lines being drawn about who is deserving and who's not deserving, because there's still an assumption that folks, receiving social security, particularly on job seeker and other payments, are not doing work. And I think it's really important to highlight the extraordinary contributions that folks are making, and it revolves around this space of care that we all rely on. And childcare, elderly care, community care is all important, but there's also really critical work of effective care to keeping us all surviving and connected. We saw that so alive in COVID. So I think, thinking about the centrality of care and really valuing that and honouring it, I think is really important. The other thing I want to say is that the current social security system is not one of care at all. It's a welfare system, but it's not a caring system. And, we have a system that is designed on deterrence. And actually China and myself, we did some tracing of the sort of colonial links of the Australian welfare system, because of course it comes from the British one that China has described, but there's so much still in common. And the logic of deterrence still completely defines our system about who is eligible and needing, and how the sort of system is based on distrust that you were talking about, and the kinds of hoops that people have to jump through. So yes, there's been some shifts, but I just want to underscore there's new drawings of lines around who's deserving and undeserving. Just today we saw the federal government pass legislation to continue compulsory income management in this country. They said that the cashless debit card would end. What they did was repackage it into what's now called enhanced income management. It's the same technology. And folks that were put on compulsory income management in the Territory in 2007 remain on that card. It's gone from the basics card, they might have got put on the cashless debit card, now they're going on to enhanced income management. And that piece of legislation does not have a sunset clause, so it's here to stay. That's extremely concerning. And so I just think we have to be careful about when we talk about sort of the shifts of this new government. I think there has been shifts, and I'm so thrilled that Parents Next is gone. I think there's different lines being drawn, and there's people being left behind. And that slow violence that China talks about is so much here. The fact that folks have been left behind on this payment that Dina you've described, that is not, how people are living on it is just, it should never, nobody should ever be in that position, people being left behind.
And Elise, I know you've done a lot of work around basic income. So basic income is often kind of forward as a transformative change. Can you reflect on, but at the same time, basic income can also, as we've argued, be a kind of a red herring, because everyone goes, yeah, let's do basic income and forget about the problems that are here and now. How can you kind of draw a thread between dealing with the current challenges and issues with something as ambitious as, say, a universal basic income?
I mean, it's not that ambitious. Like in the start of COVID, the government overnight, the Liberal government, got suspended most mutual obligations and raised payments by $550. The COVID supplement. Myself, Kay and Kelly and others in this room did a piece of research on that, and it was like an emergency basic income. And people's lives really changed. And then they took it away, and people, and then here we are. So, like, removing conditionality and raising the rate is not that radical at all. In fact, it should just be, a base demand. One thing I think basic income is useful is thinking about like there's different models, and we can talk, I'm very happy to talk about all the different sort of models and ideas around it, but at the very least it does, I think, important political work in terms of the demand and what it's asking and the kinds of conversations it brings up. And, I think, imagining a social security system that doesn't have conditionality, where, if you need support, you have support, that, there's an economic floor so people don't fall through the cracks. I think that's, really important for us to think about and believe that we can have that.
Thanks. Now we come to Kay, who's been very patient. Now Kay, as I said, she is a member of the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, which is one of the, I suppose, initiatives that the new government, well, it was to do with David Pocock as part of a...
I wouldn't say they put their hand up.
No. But perhaps you could explain about the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee and some of the opportunities it opens up, and also perhaps talk about the opportunities and perhaps some of the constraints, and the opportunities for transformation in the current climate. Put you on the spot? Apologies.
While we're also recording. Good. Perfect. There's nothing could go wrong here, and I'm a senior ex-member of the committee. So the committee is something that I think the government was forced into and then agreed, maybe that's not a bad idea, because we can shift the blame elsewhere, I'd say. We can carve off our responsibility for things and cherry pick what we like and put the problem somewhere else if we don't like things. So I think it's a useful device for government to have a third party, like with the Women's Economic Equality Task Force. It shifts the dynamics in terms of responsibility, but maintains control over what will be done. So it's another tool of government. That said, I think that the legislation went through, we got a letter. So, by the way, would you be available next week, because we have to meet before Christmas, and this was in sort of mid to late December. So it was very quick, but they wanted things to happen. So it was a lot of goodwill and enthusiasm with zero budget at the government side. So there was secretarial support from the two department secretaries of Treasury and Social Security and Services, but zero else. It was a very quick thing that happened. So I'd say this first report was just the wish list of the people on the committee of what we can ask for, and testing the water of how's this going to go. I think there'll be more to come. Like, this is the starting point of people testing out. I'm quite disappointed at the makeup of the committee. There's a lot of men in suits on the committee, and there's some token women about the feely stuff. That really annoyed me. I'm hoping that evolves over time. I think we should call for that. I wouldn't say there's a huge gender lens on there, which, like, if we're looking at the people who are receiving payments, there's a lot of women there. It's very easy for these token people on the committee to be, like, we're the colour and movement sort of people, to be, well, the big boys are talking now about economic things, which I think, but the power comes from the people and the stories and the lived experience, and that was done very much on the fly. That's very much a criticism of the structure. In the budget that was just passed, there is a big budget for secretarial support that will occur in government, but also for research and engagement. So hopefully this will be done well and right. I think a lot of the people on the committee, there's a lot of goodwill of wanting to get that voice, because it's the people. This should be for the people and by the people. Like, welfare should be about the people. Imagine if people went in and the system met them where they are and gave them what they needed. Well, that would be a genius idea. So I think that's definitely, once you remove the sort of economic models though, there's a lot of space to say things that need to be said and to frame the work of the committee in a way that will do good things for people. I think I'd be pushing the people, the colour and movement people, as I'd be calling them. And God, I hope nobody's watching. Nobody will watch this, will they? No. But we're wanting to, like, a lot of people in the system are on the wrong payments, and we've been talking about they're having to jump through all of these hurdles to prove their worthiness. Why can't we just give them an income that will meet their needs and their health needs and let them eat at the same time? That would be amazing. Why can't we recognise that a lot of people coming into this system either have existing trauma or leave with trauma because of the system? These are the things that we need to start changing, that I think we'll see how long this committee lasts, because I think they'll be a bit careful what they wish for. So, good.
Yeah, it's a great, I suppose it's a great opportunity to at least air some of the issues. You know, the report, I know there's processes that you go to develop the report, but at least you can air the issues and...
yeah, there's a lot of freedom, which I think they won't know what to do with that. One of the things I took from China's presentation was people on the streets. We don't have that. Like, it's just this, oh yeah, yes, we're terrible, terrible people. Like, there's this very us and them mentality. We need that coming together to humanise this and to get on the streets. Like, we should be angry about this.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a real opportunity to build that solidarity if the social security system is for all of us and not just for the few, because any of us could, you know, develop a disability, become ill, whatever it is. And
Chevelle's point around the media's involvement and the media pushing back against the media. This is all part of the same ecosystem. One of the fun long COVID, one of the very fun, I mean, it's not fun, complications of long COVID is people developing autonomic dysfunction, or POTS, which is what I've got. And so I'm seeing people who are otherwise young and healthy, then all of a sudden developing, oh, like, I can't stand up for too long, or when I stand up, this happens. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, well, who do we see? What do we do? I'm like, good question. Like, and yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see the sort of like longer term response now that it's things are affecting more and more people, especially like given that rapid response to, like, yes, it was that easy to just overnight raise the job seeker payment. I will highlight, though, I am still quite salty that the disability support pensioners and carer payments were left out of that, and our rates, our expenses skyrocketed then as well, because we were paying a premium for deliveries and PPE and everything, and it's, yeah, government response constantly leaves a lot to be desired. Like,
It does show during COVID it was like a natural experiment.
Yeah.
Things could change.
yeah,
change.
absolutely, yeah, it's great.
It made an enormous difference, say, for single mums, you know.
Yeah.
Huge difference, and so disappointing for it to be sort of retracted. We've got about 10-15 minutes left, so now is the time to ask questions, talk to the panellists, talk to China, so please put your hand up. Yes, and if you could just press the thing until it turns green, people will be able to hear you.
One of the things that, can you get it?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, one of those things that I'm just listening to what you're saying is talking about the punitive quality system that's been created. But what I'm really interested in finding out about is this system is designed to get people back to work. So I wonder whether you could talk to the experiences of people who end up getting casual or part-time work that then means they no longer receive benefits, and how that impacts on them. So say for instance, with sole parents, it'd be childcare, people with disability pensions or disabilities, the lack of a healthcare card, in terms of age pension, how that affects super, and how that impacts. Because to me that seems to be one of the biggest issues as well, is that it's not just a system of a punitive welfare system. It's about this grey area where people are moving between that and low-paying jobs, and who essentially aren't even getting minimum wage, like the full-time minimum wage. They're on casual employment, so they're not in the system, but yet they still have all the impacts of poverty.
I would like to answer that question.
Would love to. Thank you for the question. So, when more recently the legislation to change the age to parenting payment single is in the House of Reps. It will go through to the Senate, and it's very interesting that there is an expansive impact assessment that supports that. And I was having a bit of a read of it, and it goes right, one of the pieces of research goes right to your question, is in 2008, and DEWA actually did their own evaluation of mums who got chucked off single parenting payment and onto job seeker, and they deemed it as a success because they were then forced off job seeker and into work. The measurement of success wasn't anything of what you were talking about, which is certainty, the ability to have to live without housing stress, the ability to provide adequate nutrition. So one of my, going back to the question before when I was talking to DEWA, I did ask them if they understood the difference between an evaluation and a marketing exercise. Because they're different, but we've been exposed to that marketing exercise for a long time. So what we evaluate is really important, and I can't tell you succinctly and with clarity what that actually means, because there is no such evaluation that has occurred. And the department evaluating their own process in a vacuum of government ideology is something that we all should challenge.
And I'd add that the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee has a large budget now, so maybe they could be made to do things and give some actual evaluations. And not me specifically.
I think China wants to answer something.
Oh, China, please do unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Just to say what an honour to listen to, and the other speakers, and I've learned so much, and there's so many crossovers, I think. But the work piece, just to put that into a bit of context, and it reminds me of some work that Elise mentioned that we did together. I think it's just so important to this, and it goes back such a long way, but kind of appears and disappears and manifests in different ways over time, but it's sort of always there. So when you go back to the poor laws in England in the 1800s, you see the creation of workhouses, for example, and you start to see there, in that creation, a distinction between able-bodied people and not able-bodied people, so kind of an early manifestation of what might come to shape how we understand disability. So certainly kind of institutionally, and the design of workhouses literally to be so awful that people will choose any job, however awful, rather than have to be in those workhouses. So that kind of, the design of fear and dread and work is so key, even such a long way back. And I think in the UK, just to give a really important kind of example of how that's affected activism, and I've learned this largely from disabled people, is that for a long time, disabled people, a lot of activism was about being entirely written off and sort of abandoned on benefits. And then we saw a complete shift by the government into like pushing anyone into work at any cost, no matter the risks, even though they didn't know the risks. And that meant for some disabled people a real kind of shift in terms of what activism would look like in relation to the benefit system and work. And no better illustration of that is the fact that what was our Department for Health and Social Security became what it is now, which is the Department for Work and Pensions. So that shift manifested in a whole load of ways. So yeah, just to say, I think work is, the discourse of work, massively important for them.
I think we've got time maybe for one more question. Anyone else like to ask a question? Yes.
Hello. Oh, that's very loud. I work in this area as a lawyer, and we chip away at what we can in the current system, but we also do some advocacy stuff. I'm conscious everyone out here is chipping away, and I'm not confident all this chipping away is going to achieve anything in my lifetime. I'm wondering what the appetite is to actually have a new system, because if you look at the current system, it's got these things like mutual obligations, the centrality of work, devaluing care, forced dependency of people in relationships, racialisation of income payments. There are all these concepts that are so wrong that form the basis of this system that we've got. I mean, I think that with COVID, it really put a lie to there's no money. All of a sudden they coughed up all this cash, threw it around, no mutual obligation, you know, anything went in that short period of time. And with the stage 3 tax cuts coming up, they're going to forego millions and millions of dollars. There's cash there. I'm just wondering what the appetite is for a new system, because we're chipping away at this thing that's just a dud, and it's going to take 20 years to have significant change, I would think.
I love that. Thanks so much. Maybe I can. I love that. Yes, and I think we need to like state it. We want something else. This current system is designed. It's not like what China said. It's not flawed. It's working perfectly. It's working exactly how it's designed, and it has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. So yeah, I think that's right. I also think we're going to be forced. Because the climate crisis is here, and this system is not up to scratch for the kind of world that we're living in, and also will increasingly live in. It's not good enough just to have, you know, random emergency payments. That, you know, the whole idea of what social security means in a climate crisis, you know, I think really needs to shift. So it's come, like I think it's going to, but I think we have to be ready, you know, to push that conversation and not take just, you know, piecemeal emergency payments as they come. The other thing I'll say is I think, you know, there's really, well, thanks to people like Narita, really important work coming, you know, discussions around treaty here. And I think, you know, there's a really important accounting of the damage the social security system has done to First Nations people, particularly. So it's not just the way in which work has been used, but the stealing of people's labour and the oppression of the social security system in assisting taking of land. There's a real accounting that's going to need to be done, a truth-telling around the social security system. And that still continues today with, you know, CDP, the cashless debit card, and you know, I mean, absolutely, and you know, the discrimination around the age pension and everything else. So, you know, I think there's important questions around reparations that will also help us. Like, we need to move into that because it'll help us with the redesign that needs to happen.
Yeah. Natasha.
Yeah, also to add to that like overall in advocacy there is and has been this big constant push to make big changes. So advocates have been pushing to scrap fully diagnosed, treated and stabilised, to scrap the tables of impairment, if they're insisting on clutching their pearls and keeping the tables of impairment, accounting for comorbidities, which is a massive thing for people with chronic illness and disability. And unfortunately, it's just not happening, but there is that appetite and there is that constant push, both from lived experience perspectives, like we're throwing constant cases in their faces of like, this is the impact, this is the real world impact of people. And then it's like, oh my God, they're spending God knows how much on fighting people. They are actively fighting to keep people off of payments that they deserved. Like, to speak to my own lived experience, I went through both levels of the AAT. I was successful both times. The first one, I believe the first one they used their own internal legal team and they challenged the decision. And they said that I was fully diagnosed, but not fully treated and stabilised. And then at the second one, they said that, well, we think that you're fully treated and stabilised, but we don't think that you're fully diagnosed. And they just completely flip-flopped on their argument. And they hired an external legal team to go over everything. It's like, you're spending however much money on a team of lawyers to ultimately end up having to back pay me for the disability support pension. Why couldn't you have just given me the support that I clearly need? And it's shocking that it took, and oh my, it's one of the biggest things for me as well was that my AAT panel consisted of 3 white men in their 60s. And for them to be the ones, and which was just, given my constant medical trauma, which is often with that demographic, to have these 3 men ultimately say, well, actually, fine, you want to tear apart this diagnosis? Great. She meets all of the criteria on chronic pain. Here you go. Like, if you dismiss the diagnosis, do you agree that she accepts the criteria? And it's like, yes. And so they're spending however much money actively fighting people. And it's like, can you just help the people that need the help? Like, we are kicking and screaming and we are crying, but we need help. And we're just not being heard. Sorry.
Congratulations on winning too. That is huge.
The fear of waiting to that last day for that appeal was just gut-wrenching.
Well done. And absolutely, at least just one simple response. Imagine for one moment, like there is a Fair Work Commission that sets the minimum wage. There's an independent body that sets Parliament wages. Just imagine if we had an independent commission that set the levels for social security. Just that change in itself, and it started above the poverty line. It can be done and it could be done.
Thanks. And Charbel, you might like to have maybe the last word.
Well, I was just thinking, I think it's important that we do engage with the media to create that political will. I think it's vitally important as well. And to get to this idea of social vitality, an idea of interdependency, I think Elise was sort of gesturing to this before. There are going to be events that will have to reconcile this interdependency and the need for a more relational understanding. So it's, I think, quite inevitable.
Thanks. I think we've run out of time. I mean, we could keep on going for longer, but we can't. So I'm going to draw it to a close. So thank you, everyone, for stimulating